One of the biggest problems with long-running gacha stories is that eventually they stop moving forward. And no, I don't mean that nothing happens. Quite the opposite actually. New characters get introduced, new mysteries appear, the world itself keeps expanding, and the plot keeps progressing further and further. But somehow, despite all of that, a lot of these stories still end up feeling strangely static. And for a while I was a little worried Nikke might eventually fall into the same trap too. Not because the story was getting bad, far from it. Nikke always had some genuinely amazing character writing and emotional moments. Still, there was always this feeling that no matter how much the story expanded, the core structure itself didn't really change that much. But lately, something changed. Between the recent main story chapters, Goddess's Fall, Pretty's side story, the development on the Counter's side, and honestly just the sheer amount of plot lines that suddenly started progressing all at once, Nikke finally feels like a story that is truly moving forward again. And that is one of the biggest improvements a gacha story can make. Now, when I say a gacha story feels static, I don't mean that nothing happens. Obviously, things happen. New chapters release, new characters get introduced, mysteries expand, the world itself keeps growing larger and larger. But I want to clarify this a little bit, because I made this statement in one of my previous videos, and I saw a couple of comments disagreeing with the idea. What I mean is that the core structure of the story often feels unchanged. The characters themselves don't evolve enough to fundamentally alter the relationships, dynamics or direction of the story long term. The world and the plot continue moving on the same thread they started with, and even though it feels like the story is expanding, most of the time it's only giving us the illusion of progression. To put it in even simpler terms, a lot of gacha stories move horizontally instead of vertically. We get more content, more regions, more characters, more lore, but not necessarily deeper progression. Because a story can absolutely move forward without truly changing. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest problems a lot of long-running gacha stories eventually run into. That's why I've been so happy seeing the recent development in Nikke. So many aspects of the story suddenly feel like they're progressing in genuinely meaningful ways, starting with the core trio themselves. For the first time in a long while, we're seeing actual evolution on the counter side, not just emotional moments or background stories, but changes that genuinely feel like they're going to stick and affect their relationships and dynamics moving forward. The story is finally allowing these characters to move forward instead of keeping them trapped in the same roles forever. And it's not only the core cast either. So many other characters have also started receiving meaningful development at the same time. Even on the drama and tragedy side of the story, I've been enjoying it quite a bit lately, which is honestly saying a lot considering I'm usually not the biggest fan of stories leaning too heavily into that direction. So yeah, for me personally, that's actually a pretty big thing. And speaking of tragedy and drama, let's just get the depressing stuff out of the way first before moving on to everything else. Tragedy is a double-edged sword. It can be used to create some of the most compelling stories out there, but at the same time, if it's not handled properly, it can easily become one of the story's weakest links. Let's take the Goddess's Fall episode and the whole situation with the Inherit Squad, with Isabel and Haran apparently being gone for good, although honestly I'm still not completely sure if that's truly the case. That whole scene was clearly meant to be tragic, it was supposed to feel impactful, but personally I think it failed to hit as hard as it should have. And I think there are two major reasons for that. First of all, those characters simply didn't get enough screen time beforehand for the emotional connection to really be that strong to begin with, and that automatically weakens the impact of the scene. Then there's the way it was presented. We don't actually see their end. We're just told that they were obliterated to such a degree that nothing remained, that they basically turned to dust. Now sure, on paper that's supposed to create a dreadful outcome, but the problem is that we never actually experience the moment itself. There's no scene that truly lets the gravity of the situation sink in emotionally, and because of that the whole thing ends up feeling weaker than it should. Of course, all of this only matters if they're actually gone for good. If they're not, then this becomes a completely different discussion altogether. But if Isabel and Haran really are supposed to be permanently dead, then honestly, I don't think the story handled that moment particularly well. Now let's compare that to the Pretty Star side story, which is probably one of the most tragic stories Nikke has told to this day. And unlike Goddess's Fall, there's honestly very little I can complain about here. This time, the story actually takes its time building their relationships carefully, so when tragedy finally strikes, it doesn't feel cheap, it doesn't feel like it's only there for shock value. Not to mention the constant twisting of the knife. In storytelling, this is when you take an already painful situation and keep making it emotionally worse and worse in ways that feel natural to the narrative. Take Pretty herself, for example. They could have easily written a completely new Nikke for the story. They could have made some entirely original character become the symbol of the arc. But they didn't. The fact that Pretty is revealed to be the girl Oswald adopted already changes everything emotionally, especially because we already know how her story ends. That's the first twist of the knife. But it doesn't stop there. We see this genuinely beautiful relationship between her and her adoptive father slowly develop, only for it to all break apart because of misunderstanding and fear. Then, just as we approach the inevitable tragedy, they finally begin repairing that relationship. Oswald finally accepts the path he chose, and the story shows this beautifully through something very small, him willingly leaving his gun behind before going to watch her concert. But that's exactly what makes the moment so painful, because we know that if he had only kept that gun with him, Pretty might not have ended up the way she did. That's another twist of the knife. And it's not only Pretty's side of the story either. Even Annie's role in all of this is heartbreaking. Pretty was the person who pulled Annie out of her darkness. She gave her a reason to move forward. And yet in Pretty's final moment, Annie is there watching everything unfold, desperately trying to help her, only to die trying to protect her as a human. That becomes the moment Annie herself turns into a Nikke, another twist of the knife. Usually, one or two emotional blows are already enough for a tragedy to work, but here, the story keeps layering them on top of each other all the way until the very end. Even when Pretty fully understands what awaits her, she still willingly accepts it. She chooses to become a symbol for Nikke. She chooses to crave a path forward so others after her might live better lives. This is how you do tragedy well. Unlike Goddess's Fall, where the tragedy mostly comes from simply facing an opponent stronger than you, the tragedy in Pretty feels deeply rooted in human nature itself, in fear, misunderstanding, prejudice, guilt, and the horrifying reality that sometimes the only way forward is through sacrifice. That's a much more compelling kind of tragedy to me. You know when you hate something emotionally, but at the same time you can't even complain about it because it's written so well? That's exactly how this story felt to me. And Pretty isn't even the only example lately. Even smaller stories have been handled surprisingly well. Take Annie's friend from high school for example, the one who later came back to support her during her idol journey. The fact that she ended up taking her own life out of guilt, believing she disappointed Annie's, even that relatively small scene hit much harder than the goddess's fall death did. Or even Liverin's side of the story. That final scene between her and Fragile was genuinely chilling. That's exactly what Goddess's Fall was missing. A scene, a moment that truly lets the tragedy settle in and chills you to the bone with the outcome. There's honestly a lot more we can talk about here, but I think that's enough depressing stuff for now. Nikke hasn't only been improving on the tragedy side of things, the evolution of the characters, the plot itself, and honestly the entire world of Nikke has also been moving forward in some really amazing ways lately. The sheer amount of narrative threads that were stagnating until now finally culminating back to back is crazy to see. And honestly, it's no surprise that gacha games tend to take a very long approach when it comes to setup. One single narrative thread might take literally years before it progresses in any truly meaningful way. Nikke isn't really any different in that regard, and while I'm usually not the biggest fan of stories stretching their setup for that long, when everything finally comes together in a genuinely satisfying way, it just feels rewarding. That's exactly what Nikke has been doing lately. But what impressed me the most isn't only the amount of narrative threads finally moving forward, is the way they all connect to each other so seamlessly. Structurally, they've done such an amazing job lately. Even though the story has been progressing on so many fronts at the same time, everything still feels connected naturally instead of fragmented. Nothing feels like it exists in isolation anymore. That's one of the biggest reasons the story suddenly feels so alive lately. Starting with the counters themselves, despite being the core trio of the story since the very beginning, it always felt like they didn't receive as much attention as they deserved for a long time. So finally seeing their backstories unfold, seeing their emotional journeys progress, and watching them genuinely evolve as characters in meaningful ways, I can't help but love it. This is easily one of my favorite aspects of Nikke right now. And the interesting part is that they didn't only evolve emotionally, they evolved narratively too, even on the power side of things, which was always a little strange before, because narratively, Counters were always presented as one of the most important squads in the story, yet at the same time, all three of them still felt relatively ordinary for a long while. So seeing them gradually become stronger alongside their emotional growth, actually becoming the kind of squad that the story always presented them as, is genuinely satisfying to watch. And somehow, along the way, Rappi, who initially felt like the clear emotional centerpiece of the trio, slowly started taking a bit of a backseat lately. If I had to choose the emotional strongest story out of the three right now, it would probably be Anis. Meanwhile, Neon, surprisingly enough, might actually have the most interesting story setup of all three, and that's probably the last thing I expected considering she spent so much of the earlier story functioning mostly as a comic relief. Not only is her story suddenly much deeper than expected, but it also feels heavily tied to the larger plot itself, which surprised me in the best possible way. I think that's the biggest change lately. Nikke no longer feels like a story that's simply expanding. It finally feels like it's evolving. Of course, it's not only their personal stories that finally move forward, we also got some long-awaited reunions that the story has been building towards for such a long time. Rappy finally reuniting with Snow White was one of those moments I had been waiting to see for ages. Then there's Anderson and Dorothy finally meeting as well, another narrative thread that honestly took way too long to happen. And yet, when these moments finally arrive, they feel worth the wait. Then we move to some surprisingly amazing development on the antagonist side too, starting with what is honestly probably the most interesting antagonist in Nikke right now, Mustang, or rather the original Mustang. That guy is exactly the kind of antagonist I love seeing in stories, the kind of character you absolutely cannot stand as a person, yet at the same time you can't help loving as a character because they're just so entertaining and bring so much energy to every scene they appear in. And the way the whole story between him and Hansen developed, even if most people already guessed where it was heading, actually seeing it unfold was still crazy. Honestly, it might be one of the most interesting developments in the story so far. Then on the other side we have Birmingham. I gotta say, I did not expect nearly this much from his character. Our first impression of him was obviously pretty terrible. Still, not long after that, there were already signs that he might eventually end up being one of the genuinely good people inside the arc. But the way they slowly unfolded his character development was so well done, and somehow over time, Birmingham became one of the most genuinely likable characters in the story for me. I really love what they did with him. And of course, we can't really end this discussion without talking about the protagonist too, because there have been some really interesting developments on that side as well, and not only on the personal side either. Since they're the main protagonist, their development naturally pushes the main story itself forward too. What surprised me the most, honestly, was the direction the story took here. I fully expected that as the protagonists gain more authority and influence, there would also be much stronger backlash from the Ark government and the higher-ups surrounding them. But instead we're seeing more and more of these major figures actually supporting him. The fact that the protagonist is getting dangerously close to becoming deputy chief, while so many important people are actively backing that possibility, is such an interesting development for the story, because it changes the entire direction and scale of where the narrative can go from here. And while I still have my own nitpicky criticism about Nikke, it's really not surprising at all that this is considered one of the best stories in the gacha space right now, especially after everything that's been happening lately. Honestly, I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is just how different the world of Nikke feels compared to where it started. With the third surface reclamation war right around the corner, the queen finally starting to take center stage, a new artificial queen being created that somehow is even stronger than the original one, and so many long-running narrative threads finally culminating one after another, it genuinely feels like the story dynamic of the world has shifted on a massive scale. And that's not something we really see that often in gacha stories. Usually, no matter how much the plot progresses, the world itself still somehow feels fundamentally the same. But Nikke lately, the story crossed some kind of turning point. The scale is changing, the stakes are changing, the characters are changing, and maybe most importantly, the direction of the story itself finally feels unpredictable again. And if all of this proves something, is that Nikke absolutely deserves his reputation as one of the best stories in the gacha space right now, undoubtedly. All in all, I feel like I haven't made nearly enough Nikke videos on this channel, considering I've been playing the game since day one without really missing anything, and I think part of that comes from the fact that I have a pretty strange relationship with the story. Usually this isn't really the kind of story I get attached to at this level, mostly because of the heavier tragedy side of it. And honestly, I'm not even completely sure why. When it comes to books, I don't really mind tragic stories that much, but in these long-running mediums like gacha stories, manga, anime or light novels, I always found it harder to really connect with stories that lean too heavily into tragedy. So in a weird way, Nikke ended up becoming a pretty special story for me. Although honestly, maybe the absurd gun girl aspect of it helped soften the emotional damage a little bit. That might be part of it. Who knows? But anyway, what do you guys think about the recent developments in Nikke? Did you enjoy all the recent character and plot progression? And do you think Nikke deserves to be called one of the best stories in the gacha genre right now? Let me know in the comments.